The school hallways were always busy in the mornings. Students rushed to their classes with backpacks hanging loosely from their shoulders, teachers carried papers, and lockers slammed shut. Among all this noise, there was one figure who quietly moved through the halls every single day. He was Mr. Carter, the school janitor. He wore his faded blue uniform, carried his mop, and always had a gentle smile on his face, even though few people ever stopped to notice him. To most, he was just another worker, someone who cleaned the mess after everyone else had gone home. But what many didn't see was the small shadow that often followed him: his daughter, Maya. She was 14, a quiet girl with bright eyes and a heart that held dreams bigger than anyone around her could imagine. Because her father worked long hours, she often waited for him in the school library or sat quietly in the gym after her classes ended. She didn't mind. She loved being around her father, and even though their life was not easy, she always felt safe when he was nearby. Maya was different from the other kids. She didn't wear the newest clothes, and she didn't walk around with the latest gadgets. Her shoes were slightly worn out, her bag was a hand-me-down from her cousin, and her lunches were always simple. Some classmates teased her gently, asking why she never bought the fancy snacks from the cafeteria, but she never answered back. She had learned early from her father that dignity didn't come from money or appearances. It came from how you carried yourself. Still, school wasn't always kind. Some teachers barely noticed her. A few even looked at her differently once they realized she was the janitor's daughter. To them, she blended into the background. She was quiet, polite, and never caused trouble. But being invisible has its own kind of weight. Maya had one secret that almost no one knew. Every night, after finishing her homework, she would take out an old violin case from under her bed. The violin inside wasn't new. Its wood was scratched, its strings a little loose, but to Maya, it was the most precious thing she owned. Years ago, her father had found it at a garage sale, hidden under a pile of dusty books. It cost almost nothing because it was so worn down. But when he saw it, something inside him told him to bring it home for his little girl. He had handed it to her shyly, saying, "Maybe you can make some music with this one day." That one day had come sooner than either of them expected. At first, Maya tried to play by herself, producing squeaky sounds that made her laugh until her stomach hurt. But she never gave up. With borrowed books from the library and videos she secretly watched online, she started teaching herself. Slowly, the squeaks turned into soft tunes. And over the years, soft tunes became soulful melodies. She poured her emotions into the instrument: the joy of small victories, the sadness of being overlooked, and the love she carried for her hard-working father. But at school, she never mentioned her violin. She carried her secret like a treasure. She was afraid that if anyone knew, they would laugh at her or take it lightly. After all, who would believe that the janitor's daughter could be a musician? One Wednesday morning, in music class, something unusual happened. The class was loud, filled with chatter and laughter. The teacher, Mr. Hopkins, was in a playful mood. He was known for his sarcasm and often teased students, sometimes a little too much. That day, the class was discussing instruments, and several students had brought their guitars and flutes to show. As the lesson dragged on, one of the students, with a mischievous grin, whispered something to the teacher while pointing at Maya. Mr. Hopkins chuckled and said, well, maybe we should ask Maya to play the violin for us." The class erupted into small giggles. Some students leaned forward, curious to see what would happen. Maya froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't even told anyone she could play, but it seemed the teacher was just making a joke, not expecting her to take it seriously. The way he said it, with a smirk, made it clear he didn't believe she could do anything with the violin. It was as if he expected her to stumble, to give everyone a laugh. The words cut her deeper than anyone realized. She looked down at her desk, her fingers tightening around her pencil. For a moment, she wanted to disappear. She wanted to run out of the classroom and hide in the library until the day ended. But something inside her, something stronger, kept her still. She thought of her father. She pictured him sweeping the empty halls late at night, his hands rough and tired, yet his eyes always kind. She remembered the way he had handed her that violin with such hope, even though he didn't know if she would ever use it. She remembered the countless hours she spent practicing alone, when no one was watching, when no one believed she could ever master it. She raised her eyes slowly and spoke in a soft but firm voice, "I can play." The classroom went silent for a second. The teacher raised his eyebrows, half surprised, half amused. "Oh? Is that so?" he said, trying to keep the joke alive. "Well then, by all means, show us." He clearly expected a disaster. The students whispered, some laughing quietly, others leaning closer to see how badly this was going to go. In their minds, this was just going to be another funny story to tell later, how the janitor's daughter squeaked her way through a song. Maya's cheeks burned with nervousness, but she stood up slowly. Her legs felt heavy, but her determination pulled her forward. She walked to the front of the class, where the spare school violin rested in its case. It wasn't as familiar as her own violin at home, but it would do. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it. When she positioned the violin under her chin, the room filled with tension. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the first note. Maya closed her eyes for a moment. She blocked out the whispers, the smirks, the memory of the teacher's mocking tone. She thought only of the music inside her, the music she had carried for years without anyone knowing. And just as she drew the bow across the strings, a spark lit inside her. The bow touched the strings, and for a second the whole classroom held its breath. The students who were ready to laugh found themselves waiting. The teacher leaned back in his chair with a faint smile, sure this was going to be a short and embarrassing show. But as the first notes came out, something unexpected happened. The sound wasn't screechy or broken. It was soft, rich, and smooth, like a warm breeze passing through the room. The first melody rose gently, filling the silence, and everyone's smiles froze on their faces. The laughter that had been bubbling in some corners of the room disappeared at once. Even the students who had prepared to make jokes sat still, their eyes slowly widening. Maya kept playing, her fingers moving gracefully on the strings. At first, her hands trembled with nerves, but as the music poured out, the fear melted away. She was no longer in that classroom filled with doubtful eyes. In her mind, she was at home again, sitting by her window, the soft glow of the lamp falling on her violin as she practiced late into the night. She was back in those quiet hours when the world felt distant and only her music kept her company. The tune grew stronger, deeper. The sound carried more than just notes, it carried years of practice, quiet determination, and a heart full of emotions. Every time she moved the bow, it told a story. It spoke of her father's hard work, of her own silent struggles, of the way she had been invisible in the very school where she now stood. The classroom was silent, but it wasn't the same silence from before. It wasn't the silence of waiting for a joke. It was the silence of awe, the silence that happens when something pure and powerful takes over. One boy, who had been smirking earlier, now sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Another girl, who had whispered to her friend when Maya first stood up, leaned forward, her eyes glued to Maya's moving hands. The teacher's smile slowly faded. He had expected a clumsy performance, maybe even a mess that would let the class laugh. But the sound he was hearing was nothing like that. His eyebrows furrowed, and he shifted in his seat, unsure of what to do. He had meant it as a joke, a light moment in class. But it was clear now that it had turned into something far bigger. Maya didn't see their faces. She didn't notice their shock or the way their expressions had changed. She was lost in the music. Her bow danced with more confidence now, and the melody soared higher, filling every corner of the room. The old violin in her hands, though not perfect, seemed to come alive. It sang as if it too had been waiting for this moment to prove itself. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the strings. She thought of her father, polishing the school floors late into the night while humming softly under his breath. She thought of how he sometimes paused outside her room, listening to her practice, though he never said a word because he didn't want to interrupt. She thought of how much he had given up just to give her a chance. The emotions swelled inside her, and they poured into every note she played. As the music rose to a peak, something unexpected happened inside the listeners too. A few students felt their eyes sting with tears, though they didn't understand why. They weren't used to feeling so deeply in a classroom. It was just a normal school day, yet the janitor's daughter was suddenly changing the way they saw the world. By the time she reached the final notes, the entire class was leaning forward in silence. No one laughed. No one whispered. They were caught inside the sound she had created, as if they had stepped into another world for a few minutes. When the last note hung in the air and slowly faded away, the silence that followed was heavy and meaningful. For a moment, Maya kept her eyes closed, holding on to the feeling. When she finally lowered the violin, she looked up nervously, expecting to see disappointment or mocking faces. Instead, she found a room full of wide eyes and stunned expressions. No one moved. Even Mr. Hopkins, the teacher who had called her up, sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Then it happened, the first clap. A student in the back, usually quiet, started clapping slowly. Another joined. And then, like a wave, the entire class erupted into applause. The sound filled the room louder than her violin ever had. Maya's heart raced. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. For so long, she had been invisible, overlooked, treated as if she didn't matter. And now, here they were, clapping for her. Some were even cheering. She could hardly believe it was real. Mr. Hopkins stood up awkwardly. His face was red, and his smirk had completely vanished. He cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "Well, that was unexpected," he muttered. The words were weak compared to the thunder of applause still echoing in the room. For the rest of the class, nobody teased her again. In fact, many students came up to her, asking if she had been playing for years, where she learned, and whether she could play again. Their voices were full of respect now, not mockery. Maya answered politely, though inside she still felt shy. She wasn't used to people seeing this part of her. When the bell rang, and the students rushed out, many still looked back at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Even the teacher avoided her eyes, clearly embarrassed. Maya packed the violin back into its case with careful hands, her heart still trembling from the moment. She felt different. She didn't know exactly how, but something inside her had shifted. Later that afternoon, when her father came to pick her up as usual, she walked beside him quietly. She wanted to tell him what had happened, but part of her wanted to keep it as her own little secret for now. She looked at his tired face, the lines that had deepened over the years, and she knew he was the reason she had been able to surprise them all. As they walked home, she carried her violin case a little tighter. She knew this was just the beginning. The next morning at school, the hallways didn't feel the same to Maya. Usually, when she walked in with her old backpack and quiet steps, no one even noticed her. She was just another face, another student blending into the background. But this time, it was different. Whispers followed her as she moved past groups of students. Some pointed, some smiled, and others simply stared as though they were trying to figure out how the quiet janitor's daughter had turned into someone so extraordinary overnight. Maya felt nervous under their eyes. She wasn't used to attention. She had spent most of her life invisible, unnoticed, and in a way, she preferred it like that. But after what had happened in music class, hiding wasn't possible anymore. The sound of her violin had already spoken louder than anything she could have said with words. When she entered the classroom, a few students greeted her, something that had never happened before. A girl in the front row leaned over and whispered, "You were amazing yesterday." I didn't know you could play like that. Another boy, who usually teased her for carrying a worn-out lunchbox, gave her a small nod of respect. These tiny gestures made Maya's chest tighten with both pride and uncertainty. She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled shyly and slipped into her seat. But not everyone was happy. A few students who had laughed the loudest when Mr. Hopkins called her up the day before now looked uncomfortable. They avoided her gaze, embarrassed by their own behavior. They hadn't expected her to prove them wrong so powerfully. The shame on their faces was quiet but clear. Even Mr. Hopkins himself seemed different that morning. Usually, he carried himself with an easy arrogance, cracking sarcastic jokes and enjoying the control he had over the classroom. But when his eyes landed on Maya, something shifted in his expression. He cleared his throat and looked away quickly, as if he wasn't ready to face her. Later in the day, word spread beyond just one classroom. Other teachers had already heard about what had happened. A math teacher stopped Maya in the hallway, smiling kindly. "So you're the young musician everyone's talking about," she said warmly. Maya's cheeks flushed as she nodded politely. She didn't know what to say. Another teacher asked if she could play again during the next assembly, and though the thought terrified Maya, she simply whispered, "I'll try." The truth was, she hadn't expected any of this. Playing the violin had always been her private world, something she kept hidden because it was precious. But now that the secret was out, she felt both exposed and free. For the first time, people were seeing her for something other than who her father was. At lunch, while Maya sat alone at her usual table, she noticed her father cleaning the far side of the cafeteria. He pushed the mop across the floor with steady movements, just as he always did. His uniform was still faded, his back slightly bent from years of labor, and most students walked past him without a second thought. But to Maya, he was her hero. She wanted to run over and tell him everything that had happened, how the whole class had clapped for her, how even the teachers were shocked. But she hesitated. She didn't know how to put all of it into words, and part of her wanted to surprise him when the moment was just right. That evening at home, Maya practiced again. This time, she played not only for herself but with the memory of all those stunned faces in her mind. The sound filled their small apartment, and her father, sitting quietly in the kitchen, listened with a soft smile. He didn't say anything, but his eyes carried a quiet pride. He knew his daughter was special, even if the world had only just begun to realize it. The following week, the school announced a talent showcase. It was a yearly event where students could display their skills singing, dancing, poetry, anything they wanted. Usually, Maya never even thought about participating. But this time, several classmates urged her to sign up. "You have to," they said. "Everyone wants to hear you again." Maya was terrified. Playing in front of one class was hard enough. Playing in front of the entire school felt impossible. But something inside her told her this was her chance not just to prove herself, but to honor her father, to show everyone that where you come from doesn't define what you can achieve. On the day of the showcase, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Students filled the seats, teachers gathered at the back, and the principal stood proudly near the stage. Performers came and went: singers, dancers, comedians. The audience clapped politely, sometimes loudly, sometimes less so. But when Maya's name was called, a hush fell over the room. Everyone remembered what had happened in music class. Now they wanted to see if it was real, if she could truly perform under the bright lights. Maya walked onto the stage slowly, her violin case clutched tightly in her hand. The spotlight felt heavy on her small figure. She placed the violin under her chin, closed her eyes, and for a moment, the nervousness threatened to overwhelm her. She thought about running off the stage, hiding in the shadows like she always used to. But then she pictured her father's face, tired but smiling, full of belief in her. That memory gave her courage. When she began to play, the first notes drifted through the auditorium like magic. The sound was richer than before, stronger. The silence in the room grew deeper, as though every single person was holding their breath again. Her fingers moved smoothly, the bow danced, and the music swelled into something so moving that it felt like it was pulling at the strings of every heart present. Some teachers wiped their eyes quietly. Students who had once ignored her now leaned forward, completely captivated. Even the principal, who had seen many talented students before, stood still in amazement. The janitor's daughter was filling the entire hall with a sound that seemed to carry not just skill, but soul. Halfway through, Maya opened her eyes for a brief moment and saw her father standing at the side of the stage. He had been allowed inside by one of the staff members, and now he stood with tears in his eyes, watching his daughter. Their eyes met for a second, and in that moment, Maya felt something powerful surge through her. She was no longer afraid. She played with even more strength, every note a message to her father, "This is for you. Everything I am, everything I've worked for, is because of you." When the final note faded, the silence lasted for a few heartbeats before the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Students stood on their feet, clapping wildly. Teachers cheered. Even the principal clapped with both hands raised high. The sound of their approval washed over Maya like a wave, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. Her father clapped too, his rough hands coming together with pride. For him, this was more than a performance. It was proof that his daughter's light could shine no matter how hard the world tried to dim it. From that day forward, Maya's life at school changed completely. She was no longer invisible. She was the girl who made the school fall silent with her violin. And the same teachers who once overlooked her now carried regret in their eyes every time they saw her. They realized they had underestimated her simply because of who her father was, and that was a mistake they would never forget. The morning after the talent showcase, the school buzzed with excitement. Everywhere Maya went, whispers followed her. Students who had never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to sit near her, smile at her, or simply say hello. In the cafeteria, kids pointed her out to their friends, saying things like, "That's her, the girl who played the violin." For the first time, she wasn't just the janitor's daughter. She was Maya, the girl who had filled the auditorium with music that still lingered in people's hearts. But while the students were talking about her with admiration, the teachers were feeling something else: shame. They remembered the day in music class when Mr. Hopkins had called her to the front as a joke. They remembered the chuckles, the smirks, the whispers that assumed failure before she even touched the bow. And now, after hearing her talent, regret settled heavily in their hearts. Mr. Hopkins was the most unsettled of all. He had been the one who started it. He hadn't meant to be cruel, but in his casual mockery, he had exposed his own prejudice. He had seen only the janitor's daughter, not the musician. When he sat in the auditorium and listened to her performance, something inside him shifted. The power of her music had left him speechless. And now, every time he saw Maya walk into his classroom, he felt a flush of guilt burn in his chest. During lunch that day, the principal called a staff meeting. The teachers gathered in the lounge, still buzzing about the showcase. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday," the principal began, her voice firm but thoughtful. "Maya Carter gave us one of the most moving performances this school has ever seen. And yet, I cannot ignore the fact that many of us failed to recognize her talent before this moment. We underestimated her." The room fell quiet. Some teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. They knew she was right. For years, Maya had been invisible to them. She had been polite, quiet, and hardworking, yet they had never looked past her background. They saw the janitor's daughter, not the brilliant student with hidden gifts. One teacher finally spoke, her voice soft. "I feel ashamed," she admitted. "She sits in my class every day, and I barely noticed her. Yesterday, when she played, I realized how blind I've been." Another nodded. "It makes you think about how many other students we overlook. How many kids carry extraordinary talent that we don't bother to see because we assume too quickly? Even Mr. Hopkins, usually full of confidence, lowered his head. I owe her an apology, he said quietly. What I did in class that day was wrong. I thought I was being playful, but I realize now that I embarrassed her. And yet she stood there, braver than anyone, and showed us something unforgettable. The principal agreed. We must do better. Maya has taught all of us a lesson. Talent and brilliance aren't determined by titles, money, or background. They can come from anywhere. And as teachers, it is our responsibility to nurture, not mock. While the teachers carried their regret, Maya continued to walk through the halls, her violin case in hand, her head a little higher than before. She still wasn't used to the attention, but something inside her had changed. For years, she had practiced in silence, carrying her gift like a secret. Now, that secret had become her strength. That evening, as she and her father walked home together, he finally asked the question he had been holding back. What happened at school yesterday? His voice was gentle, filled with curiosity. He had heard bits and pieces from other staff members, but he wanted to hear it from her. Maya smiled shyly. I played at the showcase, she said softly. He stopped in his tracks, turning to look at her with wide eyes. You played? She nodded, her smile growing. Yes, and everyone listened. Dad, they stood up and clapped. Even the teachers. His eyes filled with tears, and he placed a rough hand on her shoulder. I always knew you had something special. I always knew the world would hear you one day. His voice broke slightly, but his pride was louder than his tears. The next day, something remarkable happened. In her music class, instead of calling on the usual students, Mr. Hopkins looked directly at Maya. His voice was unsteady when he spoke. Maya, would you play for us again? The class looked surprised. Some students even turned to each other, whispering. But Maya, though nervous, nodded. She walked to the front, took out her violin, and began to play. This time, she didn't feel like she was proving herself. She felt like she was sharing something precious. The sound filled the room once more, and when she finished, Mr. Hopkins clapped the loudest. His eyes were wet, and he said something he had never said to her before, "Thank you, Maya. That was beautiful. And I'm sorry for not seeing you sooner." The apology wasn't loud, but it was enough. Maya gave a small smile. She didn't need grand words. The music had already said everything. From then on, Maya's life at school was transformed. Teachers who had once ignored her now encouraged her. They asked about her music, offered to connect her with programs, and spoke to her with genuine respect. Students who had teased her for her simple clothes or quiet nature now admired her. She was no longer just the janitor's daughter. She was the girl who had taught everyone a lesson about hidden talent and quiet strength. In the weeks that followed, the principal arranged for Maya to audition for a special youth orchestra in the city. When Maya played for them, the judges were blown away. They didn't care about her background, her father's job, or the old violin she carried. All they cared about was the sound, the soul in her music. She was offered a scholarship on the spot. When Maya told her father the news, he couldn't hold back his tears. He hugged her tightly, whispering, "You've made me the proudest father in the world. All those nights, all those sacrifices, they were worth it. Because now, the world finally hears what I've always known." Back at school, the story of Maya became something teachers shared with new students. They told it not as just a story of talent, but as a story of humility, of regret, and of the importance of seeing beyond appearances. And whenever Maya walked through those halls, violin case in hand, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was a reminder that greatness can rise from the most unexpected places. And the teachers who once laughed quietly at her now carried a different memory, one of a lesson they would never forget. The seasons changed, and so did Maya's life. The girl who once walked through the school halls unnoticed was now seen with admiration. She still carried the same old violin case, and she still wore her simple clothes, but the way people looked at her was different. They no longer saw the janitor's daughter. They saw the musician, the girl who had stunned a whole auditorium into silence. Yet, through all this, Maya remained humble. She never bragged, never reminded anyone of their earlier laughter. She continued to practice quietly, often in the corner of her small bedroom while her father read his newspaper nearby. Their apartment was still modest, the kitchen still smelled of floor cleaner from the supplies her father carried home, but now there was something new in the air: hope. One evening, Maya sat with her father after dinner. The table was covered with simple food: rice, beans, and a few vegetables. Her father leaned back in his chair, tired from a long day of work, his hands rough and his shoulders aching. Yet his eyes sparkled when he looked at her. "You know," he said softly, "the day you were born, I promised myself that you would never feel less than anyone else. I couldn't give you riches, but I hoped I could give you strength. And now, look at you. You've given me more than I ever dreamed." Maya smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She thought of all the nights he had come home late, exhausted, but still found the energy to ask about her day. She thought of how he had bought her that old violin at the garage sale, not knowing it would change both their lives. And she realized something important: it wasn't just her playing that had touched people's hearts. It was the story behind it, the love and sacrifices woven into every note. The scholarship to the youth orchestra opened new doors. Twice a week, Maya traveled to the city for rehearsals. At first, she felt out of place among the other students. Many of them carried shiny, expensive instruments and wore clothes from stores she could never afford. Some even arrived in cars with chauffeurs. But when she played, none of that mattered. Her music spoke louder than any brand name. Soon, even those privileged students looked at her with respect. They could see that her talent was not bought but earned. Back at her school, she became an inspiration. Younger students whispered her name in admiration. Teachers used her story as an example of why they should never underestimate anyone. Mr. Hopkins, especially, treated her with a kindness that was almost surprising. He often asked her to play in class, not as a joke this time, but because he truly wanted others to hear her gift. But Maya never forgot the lesson of that day when she had been called to the front as a joke. She remembered the sting of their laughter, the way her cheeks had burned with shame before the first note left her violin. She carried that memory not as a wound, but as a reminder. She knew there were many others like her, students who were overlooked because of their background, their clothes, or their quiet nature. She promised herself that one day, she would use her music not only to rise but to lift others as well. One Saturday evening, the youth orchestra performed in a large city theater. The hall was filled with families, teachers, and music lovers. Maya's father sat in the front row, his uniform freshly washed, his shoes polished, even though they were old. He sat tall and proud, his eyes never leaving his daughter. When Maya walked onto the stage, violin in hand, she felt his gaze like a shield around her. She played with her whole heart, and when the audience erupted into applause at the end, she looked down and saw her father wiping his eyes. After the performance, a music director from a prestigious academy approached her. "You have something rare," he said gently. "Not just skill, but soul. We would like to support your future studies." Maya was stunned. It felt like a dream, too big to fit into her hands. She could hardly wait to tell her father. That night, as they walked home together through the cool city streets, her father stopped suddenly. He looked at her, his face glowing with pride despite the wrinkles of exhaustion. "Maya," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "do you know what you've done? You've changed everything. Not just for yourself, but for me too. People used to look right through me when I cleaned those halls. But now, when they see me, they see your father. They see a man who raised someone extraordinary. You've given me dignity I never thought I'd have. Maya hugged him tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. No, Dad, she whispered. You gave me everything. Without you, I would never have picked up the violin. Every note I play is yours. Back at school, the final moment of change came during an assembly. The principal stood before the students and staff, announcing Maya's scholarship to the academy. The entire auditorium clapped and cheered. Mr. Hopkins walked up to the microphone, his voice shaky but sincere. I want to say something, he began. I once underestimated Maya. I made a mistake. I thought it was funny to put her on the spot, but she showed me and all of us that true talent knows no background, no labels. She taught me more in one song than I've learned in years of teaching. For that, I thank her. The whole room erupted into applause again, louder than before. Maya sat quietly, her face red with embarrassment, but deep inside, she felt peace. The same people who had once doubted her were now learning from her. The laughter that had once hurt her was gone, replaced with respect. In the weeks that followed, Maya continued her journey. She practiced harder than ever, balancing school, orchestra rehearsals, and her dreams. She faced challenges, of course moments of doubt, days when the music felt too heavy, nights when exhaustion made her want to stop. But every time, she remembered her father's hands, rough from years of mopping floors, placing that old violin in her lap. She remembered the sound of applause in the auditorium. And she remembered the lesson, that one moment of courage can change everything. Years later, when Maya stood on a bigger stage, performing for an audience that filled a concert hall, she still carried the same old violin case, worn and scratched but full of memories. She had a new, polished violin by then, but she never let go of the first one. It reminded her of where she came from. It reminded her of her father's sacrifice, of the teacher's regret, and of the moment she first lifted her bow in a classroom filled with doubt. And whenever she spoke to younger musicians, she always said the same thing: don't let anyone's laughter silence you. Sometimes the world will only see your father's job, your clothes, or your silence. But when you find your voice, whether it's in music, art, or anything else, let it speak so loudly that they can never forget it. Maya's story lived on in that school. It wasn't just the story of a girl who played the violin beautifully. It was the story of courage, of breaking stereotypes, of proving that greatness doesn't ask for permission to exist. And every time her father walked through those school halls with his mop, people saw him differently. They no longer just saw a janitor. They saw the proud father of Maya Carter, the girl who turned a joke into a masterpiece.